Come closer. The shadows have missed you, and tonight they have a new story to tell. Welcome to Scary Stories After Dark. The body sat up. Not slowly, not with the rigid creak of rigor mortis easing off muscle, but with a violent, jerking motion that cracked the embalming table and sent Storm's gloved hand flying across the room with the scalpel still in it. She froze. The corpse's eyes were closed, its mouth slightly open, still like it had never moved at all. Storm blinked, her breath hitched. A faint squeal escaped her lips. Half shock, half laugh, the sound of someone who just watched a car crash and isn't sure if it was real. The cold November air leaking through the funeral home walls wrapped its damp fingers around her throat as she backed away from the body. The mortuary table creaked again, this time under her own boot as she stumbled. The dim yellow light above flickered once, twice, and then steadied like it had just blinked and decided to keep going. "Nope," Storm whispered, her voice barely audible through the surgical mask. "Absolutely not. You're dead. You're staying dead. That's the deal." The embalming room stretched before her like the belly of some sleeping beast. Concrete floor, stainless steel counters, a row of cabinets filled with scalpels, tubes, and powders she was still learning the names of. And the corpse, elderly man, cardiac arrest she'd been told, was lying there as if he'd never moved. Storm's apartment was just 2 floors above, nestled in the attic of Osiris Rest Funeral Home, a looming Victorian monster of cracked wood, creaking walls, and rooms that whispered when no one was in them. The job came with rent included, a steep discount on account of the odd hours and minimal staff, and possibly the urban legends. But Storm didn't care. Rent was rent, and the dead didn't talk. At least she'd thought so. She reached down, hesitating, then grabbed her dropped scalpel with a trembling hand. As she leaned forward to resume her work, her arm brushed the corpse's sleeve. It was warm. She jumped back again, heart pounding so loudly it throbbed in her ears. The door behind her creaked open. She whirled around, nearly slashing the air with her scalpel. Standing in the doorway was Mr. Crane, the funeral director, pale, thin, a man who seemed built entirely of bones and etiquette. His suit was black, always black, his hands clasped behind his back like a Victorian butler from a cursed painting. "Something wrong, Miss Storm?" he asked. His voice was low, gravel smoothed with honey, eyes unreadable, old, too old. Storm shook her head and tried to smile. "Nope, all good. Just, thought I heard something." "You will," he said calmly, stepping inside. "The dead are not entirely silent here. Osiris Rest has a memory. It sometimes speaks." She blinked at him. Well, that's not ominous at all. His lip twitched upward, barely, a ghost of amusement, quickly dead. "If you're finished with Mr. Ennis, you may begin cleaning the reception hall. We have a new guest arriving tomorrow, a high-profile client." Storm offered a stiff nod. Her nerves still danced beneath her skin. "Sure, reception hall. Got it. Dust and disinfect and try not to scream into the darkness." Mr. Crane said nothing as he turned and drifted out of the room like a shadow that had somewhere more important to be. Storm wiped sweat from her forehead, even though the embalming room was freezing. The body on the table hadn't moved again, but its mouth. She could swear it was smiling now. She didn't look back. The halls of Osiris Rest stretched long and narrow, lined with dusty portraits of solemn people who all looked vaguely disappointed in her. She climbed the curved staircase to the second floor, where chandeliers hung dead and dusty from ceilings too high for their own good. The air up here was worse, thick, still, like the house was trying to hold its breath. Her apartment was tucked behind a crooked hallway door marked private. No one else lived up here. At least no one alive. She locked the door behind her with a quick flick and threw her bag on the moth-eaten couch. The apartment was small, single-room layout, kitchenette, ancient clawfoot tub behind a curtain. Her bed sat directly under the sloped ceiling where water stains looked suspiciously like Rorschach tests. She collapsed onto the mattress and stared at the ceiling. The silence here had a sound, like an old radio left on in another room. Faint static and the suggestion of a voice just out of range. Then came the footsteps. Upstairs, above her. Only there was no upstairs. She sat bolt upright, heart thudding again. The footsteps creaked, slow, deliberate, across the attic that wasn't there. Storm swallowed. Well, she muttered aloud, either my upstairs neighbor is a ghost or a raccoon with tap shoes. She tried to laugh, but it came out shaky. That night, the dream came. She was standing in the embalming room, only it wasn't empty. Rows and rows of the dead were sitting upright on the tables, watching her, silent, motionless, all except one, the tall man in the back, shovel in hand, mouth sewn shut, and eyes burning with a red glow that pulsed like dying stars. The smell of embalming fluid never really left Storm's nose. It clung to her hair, her clothes, even her dreams. By the second night, the scent felt heavier somehow, thicker, like it was coating her lungs from the inside. She stood in the reception hall of Osiris Rest, mop in hand, listening to the rain tap against the stained glass windows. The room was grand, almost absurdly so. Polished black and white tile floor, velvet curtains heavy with dust, and portraits of grim men and women staring down at her with eyes that had never known a smile. Storm dunked the mop into the bucket and muttered, "Yep, totally normal Tuesday night. Just me, the mop, and 30 ghosts glaring at me like I tracked mud in." The portraits didn't answer, but she swore. One of their mouths twitched. She dragged the mop across the marble. The squeak of wet fabric against tile echoed unnaturally, like the sound had bounced off walls that weren't supposed to be there. That's when she heard it. The whisper. Faint, slithering across the hall like smoke. She froze, the mop handle tight in her hand. Leave. The word was barely there, like breath on glass. Storm turned slowly, eyes darting to the stairs, to the shadowy corners of the hall. Nope, absolutely not. We are not doing whispers tonight. But the whisper came again. Leave before it wakes. Storm's skin prickled so hard she almost dropped the mop. Before what wakes? She backed up toward the staircase, her sneakers squeaking on wet tile. Her apartment door felt like the only safe thing in the world, and even that was questionable. The upstairs hallway groaned under her weight. Every step felt louder than it should have, like she was alerting something she couldn't see. She reached her apartment, shoved the key into the lock, and froze. There was something scratched into the wood of her door. 5 letters, jagged, like someone had carved it with a shaking hand. Run. Storm stared at it, then whispered, "Cute, real subtle, Casper." Her voice trembled in spite of the sarcasm. She went inside. That night she couldn't sleep, not because of the wind rattling the windows or the way her ceiling creaked even though she was the top floor. Not even because of the scratching she swore she heard in the walls, like fingernails on wood. It was the dream again. The embalming room, the dead sitting upright, and this time the tall man wasn't standing in the back, he was closer. She saw him clearer now, his silhouette long and jagged, his spine bowed under the weight of something she couldn't see. A shovel rested against his shoulder, his head was tilted too far, like it was broken, and those eyes, red, flickering, watching. Storm woke with her heart in her throat, breath shallow. The next morning, the funeral home had visitors. She hadn't seen anyone living in Osiris Rest since she started, not besides Mr. Crane, but now the front doors opened for a delivery man lugging boxes of lilies and black ribbon. He paused when he saw her scrubbing the reception counter. "You work here," his voice was hoarse. Storm nodded. "That's the rumor." He stared at her for a long beat. Then his mouth twitched and he muttered, "Huh, don't see many. Last long." She frowned. "Thanks for the pep talk." The man looked at the floor, then at the door. His voice dropped. "You've seen him, haven't you?" Storm froze, rag stilling mid-swipe. "Seen who?" "The grave digger." Storm blinked. "I don't think so." The man leaned in slightly. His breath smelled like cigarettes and coffee. "They say he stole from the dead, took rings, necklaces, gold teeth, whatever he could pry off a corpse. Thought no one would notice." He glanced around the hall like the portraits might be listening. "When they found out, they cursed him, buried him alive. Now he digs and digs, can't stop, won't stop. Pays off the debt, they say. Pays it to this family." Storm swallowed. The mop water in her bucket felt colder suddenly. "Anyway," the man muttered, looking anywhere but her face, "don't stay here too long. Not if you hear the digging." And with that, he left, the heavy door groaning shut behind him. That night, Storm lay in bed, staring at the cracked ceiling. The house creaked, the wind whined, and then scrape, scrape, scrape. Right outside her window, the sound of a shovel biting into earth. The digging stopped at dawn. Storm wasn't sure if she'd actually slept or just blacked out from exhaustion, but when her alarm shrieked, the only thing outside her window was fog, a heavy, suffocating gray blanket that made the entire graveyard look like it had been erased. She muttered into her pillow, "Nothing like a scenic cemetery view to start the day." The apartment felt colder that morning, like Osiris Rest had exhaled in the night and left nothing but ice in its lungs. Her breath puffed out in tiny clouds as she threw on her hoodie, shoved her hair into a messy bun, and headed downstairs. The reception hall was dim, shadows pooling in the corners like spilled ink. She wasn't alone. Someone stood by the grand front doors, hands in his pockets, staring up at the chandelier that hadn't been lit in decades. At first, she thought he was a guest, maybe someone coming to arrange a funeral, someone who didn't know the policy about using the side entrance. Then he turned around. She said, blinking. "You're not here for a viewing, are you?" The man smiled, not the creepy funeral home smile she'd come to expect from Mr. Crane, but an actual smile, wry, easy. His eyes were sharp, though, too sharp. "Achilles Crane," he said, holding out a hand. "I'm guessing you're Storm." She took his hand cautiously. It was warm, but not the normal kind of warm, like sunlight trapped under skin. "You're what, the errand boy?" she asked, arching an eyebrow. His smile curved wider. That's one way to put it. Dad calls it being of service to the families. Cute, she said dryly. You're the help. I'm the mop. Dream team. His laugh came quick and light, like he wasn't used to laughing but liked how it felt. By noon, Storm learned 2 things about Achilles. He was good at making her forget how wrong this place felt, and he was hiding something. He moved through Osiris Rest like he'd been born in the walls, which he probably had, but he avoided certain rooms, certain questions. Been here your whole life? Storm asked while they polished the antique caskets for display. Something like that, he said, shrugging. She smirked. Cryptic. I love that. I try. He had a way of glancing at her like he was in on a joke she hadn't been told yet. It should have been charming. It was charming, but it was also unnerving. That evening, they cleaned the viewing room together. The casket in the center was empty, supposedly. Storm leaned over, rag in hand, and muttered, "You ever get the feeling these things are gonna pop open on us one day, like, bam, surprise corpse party?" Achilles didn't look up from the candlesticks he was polishing. "Wouldn't be the worst thing that's happened in this house," he said casually. Storm stilled. "That's oddly specific." Achilles smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. Later, Storm climbed the stairs alone. Achilles had disappeared, just gone, mumbling something about finishing up downstairs. She unlocked her apartment, tossed her bag on the couch, and collapsed on the bed. The silence pressed in. Then, a knock. Soft. Too soft. She froze. No one knocked up here. Storm crept to the door, heart hammering. The peephole showed nothing but dark. When she opened the door, the hallway was empty. Only, on the floor, someone had left a single object. A shovel, old, rusted, and streaked with fresh dirt. The shovel stayed where she found it, propped against her apartment door, rust glinting in the hallway light like dried blood. Storm stared at it for too long because when she finally reached down to pick it up, the wood felt warm. Not just sat in the sun, warm. Held, recently, by someone who wasn't there. She dropped it instantly. It hit the floor with a hollow clang that echoed too far down the hall, like it was rattling the bones of the house itself. Storm slammed her door, turned the lock twice, and muttered to herself, "That's normal. People leave shovels at your door all the time. It's like a welcome basket, but creepier." But she didn't sleep. Not really. By morning, the shovel was gone. Only a muddy boot print remained, smeared across her threshold. The day passed in a fog of coffee and bleach. Storm mopped, dusted, and stayed as far from the embalming room as possible. The town of Resurgence End was even grayer than usual. November skies pressed low like wet concrete. The streets all curved inward as if the whole town was leaning toward Osiris Rest. Storm didn't realize it yet, but from above, those winding streets formed a pentagram around the funeral home, like a spider web spun from asphalt. She just knew every road ended here, like there was no other way out. She was in the graveyard when she heard the first digging sound in daylight, a low, methodical scrape of metal biting dirt. Scrape. Pause. Scrape. Storm froze. The wind stilled as if holding its breath. "Achilles?" she called out. No answer. She turned a corner between crooked headstones and her stomach sank. A fresh hole gaped open in the far corner of the cemetery. The earth around it looked torn, like something hadn't been buried but dragged out. Storm's breath hitched. Yeah, that's not ominous at all. Inside the funeral home, she found Achilles leaning over the reception desk, flipping through an ancient leather-bound ledger. "You dig graves in your free time?" she asked, dropping her rag on the counter. Achilles looked up, amused. "Not my hobby, no." "Funny, someone does. Someone who leaves rusty shovels at my door like party favors." The smile faded from his mouth, but not from his eyes. "Did you touch it?" Storm blinked. "The shovel?" Achilles' voice dropped low. "Don't." That night, she heard the digging again, but closer, under her window. Storm bolted upright in bed, heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She crept to the glass, slowly, every step an argument with her own instincts screaming, "Don't look, don't look." She looked. The fog lay heavy across the graves, but she could still see him, tall, too tall. A long, thin figure hunched over, working the shovel into the earth with slow, deliberate strokes. The gravedigger. His spine bowed in unnatural angles, his head cocked to one side like it had been snapped halfway. His eyes caught the faint moonlight, red, flickering, and then he stopped digging, straightened, turned, and looked right at her. Storm stumbled backward from the window so fast she tripped over the chair, hitting the floor hard. By the time she dared to peek again, the graveyard was empty. But the sound of digging echoed on, scrape, 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 like it was inside the walls now. Storm told herself she imagined it, the shovel, the digging, the tall thing with the broken neck staring up at her window. But she knew she didn't, because the next morning the mud tracked across the parlor floor wasn't hers. Dark streaks across the old marble tiles shaped like boots, but too long, too narrow. Like whoever, whatever, made them had feet that weren't entirely human. Mr. Crane didn't comment when she asked about it. He only glanced at the streaks, his mouth curving into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Things have a way of finding their way inside," he murmured, as if that explained anything. Storm muttered under her breath. "So do cockroaches." By evening, she was back in the embalming room. She hated this room more than anything. The chill wasn't just cold, it sank into her bones, into her teeth. The smell of formaldehyde hung in the air so heavy it felt like a physical weight. Tonight, there were 2 bodies laid out for prep. Storm tugged on her gloves, forced on her playlist of sarcastic 90s punk, because who doesn't want Green Day blaring over corpses, and got to work. She was bent over the first body, a man in his 60s, when she felt it. A twitch, his hand, fingers tightening around her wrist. Storm jerked back so hard she almost tripped over the tray table. The body's eyes snapped open, cloudy, white, unblinking. It grinned. The grin stretched too wide, cracking the lips, exposing teeth that were sharper than they should be. Storm's breath stuttered out of her chest, and then it spoke, not loudly, not even clearly, just one word hissed through cracked lips. "Storm." She screamed. The scalpel flew from her hand, clattering to the floor. By the time she blinked, the body was still, mouth slack, eyes closed, like nothing happened. She didn't tell Mr. Crane. He would have just looked at her with those ancient eyes and that voice like rotting silk and said, "Sometimes the dead twitch, Miss Storm. You'll get used to it." But she couldn't get used to this. When she escaped to the hall, Achilles was there. leaning against the wall, hands shoved into his jacket pockets as if he'd just appeared. Storm's voice shook. Bodies aren't supposed to smile. Achilles tilted his head slightly. His dark hair fell across one eye. Sometimes they do. That's not funny. He studied her face for a long moment, then offered a small, crooked grin. Do you trust me? Storm blinked. I literally just met you. Fair. Do you trust me enough to keep cleaning? Storm laughed, a hollow, shaky sound. You sound like an ad for a very sketchy maid service. Achilles didn't laugh back. His gaze lingered on the embalming room door. You might want to sleep with the lights on tonight, he said softly. And before she could ask why, he was gone. That night, Storm sat on her bed, knees pulled up, staring at the apartment door. She didn't hear digging. She didn't hear whispers. She heard something worse. Footsteps, soft, barefoot, inside her apartment. Storm didn't breathe. She couldn't, because whoever or whatever was walking inside her apartment was barefoot. The steps were soft, deliberate, the kind of sound a hunter makes when it doesn't want you to hear it, but knows you will anyway. The air grew cold enough to frost her breath. She sat frozen on the bed, every muscle trembling, eyes locked on the shadow under the door. The footsteps stopped, right outside her bedroom door. Her skin prickled, every hair standing on end. Then, from the other side, a whisper, low, drawn out, too close. Storm. She reached for the lamp, her hand shaking so badly she almost knocked it over. Light filled the room. The footsteps vanished. When she opened the door, the apartment was empty, but on the floor, written in muddy, dark streaks, was a single word: awaken. Storm spent the next day in the archives of Osiris Rest, not because she wanted to play detective, but because she couldn't clean the embalming room without feeling every corpse's eyes on her. The archives were old, dust thick enough to choke on, shelves sagging under ledgers that looked like they'd been bound in someone's skin. She found records stretching back centuries, names, dates, and strange notes scrawled in spidery handwriting. Awakens soon, sleeps longer, returned. Returned? Returned from where? Storm traced one finger over an entry from 1892. The name meant nothing, but in the margin, someone had drawn a tiny blood-red pentagram. By nightfall, the house changed. It always did after sunset. The walls felt tighter, the air heavier, the whispers louder. Tonight, though, they weren't whispers. They were voices, chanting, low and guttural, coming from below. Storm followed them, flashlight in hand, down the back hallway, down the stairs that creaked like they were screaming with every step. The chanting grew clearer. It wasn't English. It wasn't anything she'd ever heard. The basement door was ajar. Storm pushed it open and froze. She shouldn't have gone down there. The basement felt wrong, like the house's throat. Stone walls slick with damp, a ceiling so low she had to duck, and in the center of the room, a slab. On it, a body. But this one wasn't still. It sat up, fluid, graceful, not like a corpse, like a predator. Its eyes fluttered open, not milky, not dead. Red, alive, watching her. The thing smiled, too many teeth. Storm stumbled back, tripping over a crate, breath caught in her chest. Before she could scream, a voice cut through the dark, calm, commanding. Enough. Mr. Crane stepped into the flickering light, but this wasn't the polite, strange man she'd met at the embalming table. This was something else. His posture changed, his face sharpened, like his bones didn't fit quite right under his skin, and when he smiled, she saw them. Rows of needle-like teeth. Storm bolted up the stairs, her heart jackhammering, every instinct screaming at her to run. But halfway up, she nearly collided with Achilles. He grabbed her shoulders, steadying her. "Storm," he whispered, eyes wide, not with surprise, but with fear. "You weren't supposed to see that." Storm's breath came in sharp, shallow gasps, the taste of dust and metal filling her throat. "You weren't supposed to see that," Achilles whispered again. His hands were still gripping her shoulders, not rough, not cruel, but firm, like he was holding her still for her own good, or for someone else. She stared at him, heart jackhammering. "What was that?" Achilles didn't answer. His jaw clenched, and for the first time since she met him, his easy sarcasm cracked. "Storm, you have to listen to me," he said, voice low and fast. "Don't go back down there. Don't." From below, a sound split the house in half. A scream. Only it wasn't human. It was deep, guttural, and hungry. The basement door slammed open by itself. Mr. Crane emerged. Only it wasn't Mr. Crane anymore. His suit hung loose over a frame that had stretched in impossible ways, shoulders too wide, arms too long, his head nearly scraping the ceiling. His skin was tight over sickly, thin bones, and when he opened his mouth, the polite voice was gone. Instead, his jaw split too far down, and rows upon rows of needle-sharp teeth gleamed in the dim light. He hissed, a sound like broken glass dragged across metal, and the bodies began to wake up. The embalming room door creaked open. Storm heard it. She heard the shuffle of bare feet on the marble, the slow, deliberate cracking of bones as the dead stretched their limbs like they'd just woken from a nap. But they weren't dead. They never had been. Pale figures emerged from the shadows, their eyes glowing faintly red, their mouths curving into unnatural smiles. Storm stumbled back, her hand finding Achilles' sleeve. "What are they? What is this?" Achilles turned to her, and for a moment, just a moment, his own eyes flashed red. Not bright, just enough to tell her the truth she already felt deep in her bones. "You weren't wrong," he said quietly. "This house isn't haunted." He glanced at his father, at the pale figures now moving with slow, predatory grace. "It's feeding." Storm's brain screamed run. Her body obeyed. She bolted down the hall, dodging one of the bodies lunging from the embalming room, its nails raking the wall where her head had been a second before. She ran for the front door, only to find it chained. The lock was thick, old, meant to keep things in. Achilles appeared beside her, grabbing her arm. "Storm, don't fight me. Don't fight me right now." "Are you one of them?" she spat, panic in her voice. He didn't answer, because he didn't have to. The look in his eyes said it all. A crash shook the house. Mr. Crane's shadow loomed against the wall, taller than any human should be, his claws dragging along the plaster as he stalked after them. He didn't run. He didn't need to. He was the hunter. Achilles turned to Storm, voice low and urgent. "Storm, you have to trust me. I won't let them have you." Before she could argue, one of the pale, dead launched itself from the side hallway, its mouth opening too wide, a scream tearing from its throat. Storm grabbed the nearest thing she could, a heavy brass candlestick, and swung, the vampire's skull cracked sideways with a sickening thud, buying her seconds. Only seconds. The graveyard doors were their only chance. Storm and Achilles ran, the house shaking with every hiss and shriek behind them. They burst into the cemetery, fog coiling around their ankles like it wanted to drag them under. And there, the gravedigger was waiting. Tall, thin, neck bent wrong, eyes like burning coals. He raised his shovel, slowly, almost reverently. For one frozen moment, Storm thought this was it. Then Achilles stepped between them, his own fangs bared now. "Yes," he said, voice like thunder. "I'm one of them, but I'm not him." What happened next was a blur of claws and dirt and moonlight. Storm wrenching the shovel from the gravedigger's hands and swinging like her life depended on it. It did. Achilles grabbing her by the wrist and dragging her past vaults and crooked stones while his father's voice roared through the fog, deep enough to shake the ground. "She is mine." They didn't stop running until the first streaks of dawn hit the horizon. The sky turned gray-pink. The house fell silent. The digging stopped. Storm collapsed onto the wet grass, lungs burning. Achilles crouched beside her, blood at the corner of his mouth, his eyes dimming back to brown. "You're safe," he whispered. But Storm looked back at Osiris Rest, the windows glowing faintly like eyes that hadn't blinked, and there, far back in the fog, she saw him. The gravedigger, standing, watching, smiling that crooked, broken smile, and then he raised his shovel and started digging again. Epilogue. The fog never lifted, even after dawn bled across the crooked rooftops of Resurgence End. It clung to the streets like something alive, sliding between tombstones, curling under doors, pooling thickest around Osiris Rest. Storm stood at the edge of the cemetery, her hoodie damp with morning mist, staring at the house she'd nearly died in. The windows stared back. Achilles stepped up behind her, quiet as ever, his coat brushing her arm. "You stayed," he murmured. Storm didn't look at him. Her eyes stayed fixed on the house. "Where else would I go?" His hand found hers, not tentative, not shy, just claiming. Her pulse jumped at the touch, except it wasn't a pulse anymore. The first time she noticed it was hours after the sun rose. She'd reached for her phone, her reflection caught in the black glass of the screen, and for the briefest second, her eyes weren't the same color they'd been yesterday. They flashed red, faint, gone in an instant. Achilles turned her hand over now, studying the pale skin, his thumb tracing the faint blue vein beneath. "You feel different," he whispered, voice soft and strange, like he wasn't sure if it was a confession or an apology. Storm let out a shaky laugh. "I don't feel dead, if that's what you're asking." Achilles looked at her then, really looked, his dark eyes holding hers with something deeper than hunger. "No," he said, and the corner of his mouth curved into a shadow of a smile. "Not dead." The wind stirred the fog, carrying with it the faintest sound of digging somewhere far behind them. Storm's lips curved too, just slightly, something caught between defiance and acceptance. Her fingers curled into Achilles's. "Whatever I am now," she whispered, her voice low and steady, "I think you made me this way." Achilles leaned closer, his breath cold against her ear. "No," he said, the word almost a vow. "We made you this way." Behind them, Osiris Rest stood silent, the shutters drawn, the fog wrapping it like a lover, but somewhere deep inside its walls, Something stirred, waiting, calling.